Mrs. Eddy by Hugh Studdert Kennedy. Chapter 2. The Early Years. Abigail Baker was in her 38th year when her youngest child was born. Early marriage was the rule in New England in those days, where a woman still unmarried at 25 was looked upon as already an old maid. But no matter how early she married, the young girl became a matron in the fullest sense of the word on her wedding day. Thence onwards, her life was her home and her children. Her children were wont to come quickly and regularly, and her family would be complete in the early 30s. 38 would be regarded as rather past the usual age of childbearing. It is not surprising, therefore, that to the thought of a deeply religious woman, as Abigail Baker was, the coming of this child in her old age should take on some special significance. In the Bible, which she loved and studied so earnestly, were many stories of children destined to greatness, being born to women in later life. And although her essential meekness and modesty caused her to view such thoughts with disquiet, she could not, as she confessed in distress to a friend, avoid their coming. In the spring of 1821, Mrs. Baker and her friend and neighbor, Sarah Galt, were much together. She was a devout and pious woman, and the two would frequently and regularly meet and talk over religious matters and pray aloud together. As runs one account of the matter, which seems to be traditional, during these meetings, Mrs. Baker many times told her neighbor, Mrs. Galt, that she felt herself to be a most wicked woman because of the strange thoughts she had regarding her youngest child, which was yet unborn. She told Mrs. Galt that she could not keep her thoughts away from the strong conviction that this child was holy and consecrated and set apart for wonderful achievements, even before her birth. She said, "I know these are sinful thoughts for me to entertain, but I cannot shake them off." Then these two devout women would talk the question over and pray together. However this may be, there can be no doubt that between the little girl Mary and her mother, there existed from the first dawning of the child's consciousness a more than usually deep spiritual bond. Abigail Baker was, in every sense of the term, a mother in Israel. Writing of her many years afterwards, Mrs. Eddy said, "Of my mother I cannot speak as I would, for memory recalls qualities to which the pen can never do justice." She seems to have been a remarkable woman, not only in point of culture, but because of a certain calm and patient wisdom which rose serenely above the many besetments of a working day and was found almost mystically at hand when help was needed. She was well named Abigail, for between her and her namesake in Israel there was a bond clear enough. The iron-willed Mark Baker, unrelenting Calvinist as he was, must often, in spite of himself, have called her blessed. she had a way of softening the rigors of his faith without hurting him, and with a fine heresy in the presence of which the voice of protest was often stopped, dwelling on the all-embracing love of God in an age committed to the horrible decree of predestination, as John Calvin rightly called his own tenet. All his long life, Mark Baker was a veritable Boanerges in matters of religion. Instant and effective in argument, he found the task of convincing a waverer or confronting a backslider particularly congenial to him, while he gloried in the sternness of his faith and in its demands for scrupulous obedience. My father's relentless theology, Mrs. Eddy wrote of him many years afterwards, emphasized belief in a final judgment day, in the danger of endless punishment, and in a Jehovah merciless towards unbelievers. But if Mark Baker was a true Baker, Abigail Ambrose was a true Ambrose. If the church militant was most in evidence in Mark, the earnest of things hoped for was the prevailing spirit of Abigail. If Mark was wont to get up and out and shake the dust from off his feet, Abigail was wont simply to stand, for she could not otherwise. So help me God. It might seem at first difficult, if not impossible, to fashion from such stuff a home characterized by the open hand, and at which the needy were always welcome, and pervaded by a love long remembered by its children. Abigail Baker did it, but the adjustment demanded in the coming together of these two heritages was tremendous, only exceeded in difficulty by the task of making the adjustment in the soul of a single individual. That adjustment, the little girl who had been named Mary was destined to undertake and carry through with portentous effect. As we have seen, she was the youngest of 6 children. 3 brothers, Samuel, Albert, and George Sullivan, and 2 sisters, Abigail and Martha, awaited her in the farmstead at Bow. The 3 boys, at any rate, and possibly Abigail, were old enough to take note of it all and to receive the new sister with the eager interest and competition in affection which in large families seems only to increase with each new arrival. If the little girl was to be spoiled, she was destined to it. From the first, she seems to have been regarded as a much prized possession by all the family, but especially by the old grandmother, who had named her Mary. Grandmother Baker was a typical New England grandmother. If Abigail was the mother of her children, Grandmother Baker was the mother emeritus, and the same gracious spirit which gave her the naming of the youngest child consigned that child specially in her care. It was Grandmother Baker who rocked Mary's cradle in those first few months as she sat by the open window, and it was Grandmother Baker who, later on, took the child on her lap and told her wonderful stories of her people, about the Indian wars and other wars, of the mighty deeds of mysterious ancestors who, far away and longer ago still, had done things worthy of remembrance. Like all families that have wandered far from their homelands, the Bakers were full of traditions, some of them well-founded, others not so well. In her book, Retrospection and Introspection, Mrs. Eddy recalls how, among her earliest recollections, was a great sword in a brass scabbard, which her grandmother told her had been given to one of her ancestors by Sir William Wallace. It lay in an old chest in the garret at Bow, along with some worn, leather-bound books and papers yellow with age, relics from the Moore household, which Marion Moore McNeill had brought with her many years before when she was married to Joseph Baker. Grandmother Baker had many other tales to tell Mary. She showed her the old newspapers which Mrs. Eddy, with all the vividness of a childhood memory, recalls contained, among other things, stories of Valley Forge, of the surrender of Lord Cornwallis, of Washington's farewell to his troops, and most vividly remembered of all, a full account of the death and burial of George Washington. Among the papers in the chest were certain manuscripts containing scriptural sonnets, besides other verses and enigmas which my grandmother said were written by my great-grandmother. It was the cherished conviction of Grandmother Baker that Hannah More was in some way among her forebears. But inasmuch as Hannah More lived and died a spinster, this was clearly one of the traditions not so well founded. But there had been no doubt in the mind of little Mary Baker. That her grandmother told her so was enough. There was, moreover, the poetry in her great-grandmother's own writing to prove it. No portrait or description of Mary as a little girl remains, but from descriptions of her in young womanhood and some incidents in her childhood, it is not imagining too much to picture her as a child of more than ordinary beauty, with large blue-gray eyes, a singularly clear skin, she never lost that, and an abundance of curly chestnut hair. She was a happy, eager child, one who gave the impression at all times of listening with all her ears. And her family early came to learn that no conversation was really over her head. She did not always get things right, but right or wrong, she always got something, and she had a way of putting fragmentary sayings and vivid expressions to strange and unexpected uses. Like most children, she loved long words. She loved them all her life. But as a child, it was specially noticeable, and she sometimes brought them out with telling effect. One instance, which is traditional, is worth recalling. Mark Baker, as has been seen, was a great man in a dispute. At no time was he more in his element than when elucidating some matter of strange doctrine or preparing with the help of Priest Burnham from across the river to administer a seemly rebuke to some recalcitrant church member. Priest Burnham was a man after Mark's own heart. Like Sarah Battle in Lamb's famous essay on whist, he really enjoyed the rigor of the game. It would almost seem that he must have felt grateful to backsliders for the satisfaction their summary confounding brought to him. Mark Baker felt very much the same. The very word backslider would at any time galvanize him into satisfying action. And so, whenever Priest Burnham crossed the river and drove up the hill from Pembroke to the Baker farmstead, he was sure of a welcome. There were other disputes of an entirely secular nature which Mark Baker was called upon to settle. He was known as a man who loved an argument too much not to see fair play, and he set his face sternly against bad language and against any display of heat calculated to impair the satisfying unfoldment of the theme. Mary was often the silent observer and auditor of these battles of words. Her sisters, Abigail and Martha, or the boys, would probably not have been admitted to the parlor where they took place. But Mary was still so small that she was overlooked. And so it happened on one occasion, when a more than usually heated argument was underway between two farmers who had brought their case to Mark Baker for arbitration, that one of the disputants raised his voice beyond the point at which Mark usually intervened with some restraining order. On this occasion, he did not intervene, and Mary, from her corner, became alert and anxious. At last, she could bear it no longer, and in a sudden lull remarked quietly, but firmly, "Mr. Bartlett, why do you articulate so vociferously?" There was silence for a moment, and then everyone burst out laughing. And it was not long before the matter was settled and all concerned were discussing good-humoredly the child's quaint speech. It passed into a family saying, and years afterwards, whenever discussion ran too high, the spell could at once be broken by some reference to Mary's quiet rebuke. It was not, however, only in the matter of quaint speeches that Mary began to stand out in the family circle. She had queer ideas about animals. Incidents that the rest of the farm household took inevitably as a matter of course occasioned her deep concern. Whether the horses were too cold in the snow, or the hens were warm enough at night, or the ducks distressed because the pond was frozen. Grandmother Baker did her best to comfort the little girl, assuring her that God cared for all his creatures. But Mary was never quite assured, and one chill evening in November, her brother Albert found her singing softly to the pigs at the other side of the pasture wall because she felt sure they were lonely. Abigail Baker, it is to be imagined, must often have wondered, as she recalled her talks with Sarah Galt, at these traits of difference in her youngest child. None of her other children had made problems of such matters as lonely pigs, inadequately warmed horses, or ducks barred from the enjoyment of their natural element by the forces of nature. Yet, to Mary, they were quite obviously real problems. Such fancies are not uncommon with sensitive children, and it is doubtful if they would have been even remembered if it had not been for another development which brought no little perplexity to Grandmother Baker and Abigail, and deep concern to Mark. Mary's sayings had always amused him, even as they often puzzled him. But the story he was to hear now from Abigail about Mary's hearing a voice calling her seems to have filled him with a doubt which bordered on fear. To the solid, intensely concrete mind of Mark Baker, in spite of the fact that he accepted the story of Samuel in its entirety, there could be nothing but something wrong when told of Mary's voices. Whatever the actual explanation may be, the account of the matter given by Mrs. Eddy herself in her book Retrospection and Introspection is her honest recollection of the matter undoubtedly. Whether Mrs. Eddy in childhood heard the voice of God by audible sound in any literal sense is surely irrelevant to the question of her own personal integrity, and irrelevant to the larger question of whether she was divinely ordained to be mankind's Savior in this age. But it is interesting enough to warrant some consideration here. Surely, with all the marvels which tax our credulity anew each day, only the reckless or the incorrigibly ignorant would deny the possibility of such supernormal occurrences as Mrs. Eddy describes from her childhood. Although conservatism would prompt the average reader to a few reservations. Fairness demands that allowance be made for the inevitable infusion of biblical concepts and comparisons by this narrator of pious bent. Many peculiar circumstances and events, Mrs. Eddy writes in later years, connected with my childhood, throng the chambers of memory. Then she goes to recall having heard a voice during her 8th year, calling her repeatedly, and of having gone to her mother only to be told that no one had called. She recites that her cousin, Mehitable Huntoon, overheard the voice on one occasion, and that her mother was troubled by their account of the strange phenomenon. Steeped as she was in scriptural lore, it is not surprising that the then little Mary and the later Mrs. Eddy sought an explanation in the story of the voice of the Lord coming to Samuel. The sincerity of this colorful account cannot be questioned, but many will challenge the reliability of human recollection in such things. Psychologists insist that everyone is subject to paramnesia, the unintentional falsification of memory. And few are likely to concede Mrs. Eddy to be the world's sole exception to this universal tendency. For those who cherish the prophet version, the voice will come 3 times and will thus foreshadow sainthood. We need not take sides in this question of no fundamental consequence, in considering the words of one who has proved herself a truly great leader. We can plumb the depths of her undeniable genius and marvel at her spectacular achievements without hanging her on a tradition which can do no less than discredit her and her work in the eyes of a skeptical age. But what about Mark Baker? Accepting without question the full teaching of Calvin as to God and heaven and hell, he nevertheless was overwhelmed at such an outrage on probability as Mary's voices. Brushing aside impatiently Abigail's less material explanation, he declared that the child's brain was too big for her body, that she must drop all her books, have done with questionings which caused him so much vague uneasiness, and go out into the field and romp and play like other girls and boys. And so the child went out, not at all averse, but her questionings went with her. Already, for Mary, the world was not the simple place it was for her sisters, Abigail and Martha, and the boys. One of the boys, however, seems to have understood Mary better than the others. Albert Baker was 11 years old when she was born, and from the first seems to have held his little sister in special regard. Her questionings evidently did not disturb him as they did his father, and as the years passed, and the little boy of 11 had come to be a big boy in his teens, and the little girl was rising 8 or 9, there began to develop between the two a relationship of rare sympathy and understanding. About the time that Mary was listening in scared silence for her voices, or slipping out of the kitchen door in the gathering darkness to sing to the lonely pigs, Albert was preparing to enter Dartmouth. All the Bakers were well taught, sufficiently well taught, as Mrs. Eddy herself has recorded, to teach school acceptably at various times. But Albert, quite evidently from his subsequent history, was more than ordinarily a student and a thinker. Along with his brothers, and later on with his sisters, Abigail and Martha, he attended the common school nearby. But whereas the brothers went no further, Albert moved on to the Pembroke Academy, and thence to Dartmouth. Mary was an eager repository for Albert's learning. How early the two began that discursive talking, which Albert alludes to in a later letter, it is not possible to say. But if the boy is, as he clearly was, father to the man, the future lawyer and congressman-elect, Albert Baker, friend and law partner of Franklin Pierce, was ready to share what he knew with an audience always ready to ask questions. And so, with the old grandmother's valiant stories, and the mother's simple faith, and Albert's unfolding record, new every morning, and her own forever questions, the little girl had much to do and many things to straighten out. One thing especially began to trouble her about now, the question of religion, she later writes. From the first moment that she was able to apprehend anything of the matter, Mary seems to have taken her religion seriously. Hers was a serious day, and religion was the most serious topic in most households of that day. But as a small child, her approach to it was not at all the accustomed one. The unquestioning acceptance of a tutored attitude not only did not commend itself to her, but never seems to have occurred to her as anything like what should be required. She devoted herself obediently to the task of learning the Westminster Catechism, and actually could say it by heart before she was 10. She went to church and Sabbath school, and sat or knelt with due devotion through the prayers and Bible reading with which Mark Baker exercised himself and his household morning and evening. But such fulfilling of all righteousness was not at all enough for her. To her brothers and sisters, and even to Mark himself, the due fulfillment of such obligations constituted the essential part of their religious life. To Mary, they were only incidents. As far as the Bible was concerned, she not only listened dutifully to what was demanded of her, but she was actually found studying it at all times with absorbed interest. This, combined with the fact that while she was willing and eager to believe in the love of God, she did not seem to be at all reconcilable to the wrath of God, caused Mark no little misgiving. The wrath of God was, of course, his great standby. The love of God was well in its way, but the wrath of God was the real thing, and Mary's apparent conviction that the care which she was convinced from her grandmother God bestowed on lonely pigs and cold horses must be extended to all men regardless of sect, Mark Baker viewed with increasing disquiet. Already, as he saw it, he had had more than his share of trouble with his children in this matter of religious conviction or lack of it. Up to the time that he began to be concerned about Mary, none of them had made any formal profession of faith. And Mark was not only greatly troubled, but completely at a loss to understand what it could mean. To him, religion was essentially a grand thing, a mighty exercise, and exalting conflict with enemies worthy of his weapons. He could not understand any man worth the name not being eager to throw his hat in the ring and go to it. With backsliders to be found in every community, and grand differences of doctrine constantly arising, any failure to take advantage of such opportunities was to Mark Baker simply incomprehensible. It was not that his children, but especially his sons, were in any sense of the word irreligious, or even lax in the meeting of their religious obligations. On the contrary, they all seem to have been even scrupulous in doing so. Only they had never found religion in the almost unctuous fullness of that term, as Mark had done. Mary had always been his hope. True, her exceptional devotion occasioned him some uneasiness. The stories Abigail told him from time to time, of long Bible readings, of prayers carefully written out and composed, of brave determinations on the part of his small daughter to emulate her hero Daniel and pray 7 times daily with her faced towards the east, all this was not as it should be. Abigail does not seem to have been troubled by it. Neither, it is to be imagined, would Mark have been, had it not been for Mary's growing tendency towards restless inattention, if not open dissent, whenever, in their discussion of religious matters, he touched upon the subject dearest to his own heart, the great doctrine of unconditional selection. Predestination, endless punishment, inexorable decrees. Many a time, no doubt, had he and Priest Burnham rejoiced over them together. Mary obviously shrank from them. Naturally joy-loving and light-hearted, as one contemporary described her, she seems to have rebounded from the grave and distressful view of things, as Mark would have them, with a most unseemly ease. There was nothing morbid in her childish devotions. No doubt she shared in the luscious gloom of the period, and could sigh with the best of them over withered joys and perished hopes, over graveyards and upturned sods and what not. But when faced with a real issue such as her father was propounding to her so vigorously, she came out every time quite emphatically on the side of the cared-for animals, rather than that of the eternal punishment of unbelievers. It was clearly her father's duty to do something about it. Mary was in her 12th year when they finally came to grips. Mark was satisfied that it was about time that she made a formal profession of faith, and, after the fashion of those days, he felt that it was laid upon him to prepare her for the exercise, and to see to it that she was sound in the doctrine of good understanding. This brought the matter, the whole question of predestination and the horrible decree of endless punishment, right out into the open between the two. Mark quickly found his worst fears confirmed. To his utter perplexity, he discovered that the doctrine that filled him with such exultation aroused in his daughter nothing but dissent. She was unwilling to be saved if her brothers and sisters were to be doomed to perpetual banishment from God. Nothing that Mark Baker could say or do would change her. He spoke of the final judgment day, of the dangers of endless punishment, and of a God utterly merciless towards unbelievers. Mary stood her ground, but she sank physically under the struggle. She could not sleep at night, and grew worried and anxious. Whether Abigail actually intervened at this point, it is not possible to say, but that something happened to awaken Mark to a sense of what he was doing is certain. For the next time we see him, he is rushing from the house towards the stable, hitching a horse to the wagon, and driving recklessly down the hill towards Pembroke to fetch the doctor. The story seems to be well-founded that some way down the road he met a neighbor who hailed him with concern, asking him where he was going in such a hurry. But all he got for an answer, as Mark urged his horse to great efforts, was the agonized shout, "Mary is dying." But Mary was not dying, and although the old doctor, who knew Mark Baker, declared she had a fever and must be kept quiet, he made it clear to a much chastened and sobered Mark that there must be an end to his great missionary work. The old doctor guessed, but it was Abigail Baker who really understood, and in her handling of a difficult situation disclosed a rare sympathy and wisdom. At a moment when a mother's advice to submit or compromise would have been easy to give and obvious, Abigail refrained. She told the child simply that God would guide her and make the way clear for her. Writing of the incident many years afterwards, Mrs. Eddy says, "My mother, as she bathed my burning temples, bade me lean on God's love, which would give me rest if I went to Him in prayer, as I was wont to do, seeking His guidance." I prayed, and a soft glow of ineffable joy came over me. The fever was gone, and I rose and dressed myself in a normal condition of health. And then she goes on to relate how from that moment the horrible decree of predestination, the dread of the day of judgment, and of a God merciless towards unbelievers, forever lost its power. But the small heretic had to go through one more ordeal before she could reckon herself to have won her first great battle for freedom. She loved her church and was not at all averse from her father's wish that she should become more closely united with it, but not at the expense of her convictions. How the gap was finally bridged is best told in her own words. Writing of her examination before the church members, she says, "The pastor was an old-school expounder of the strictest Presbyterian doctrines. He was apparently as eager to have unbelievers in these dogmas lost as he was to have elect believers converted and rescued from perdition. For both salvation and condemnation depended, according to his views, upon the good pleasure of infinite love. However, I was ready for his doleful questions, which I answered without tremor, declaring that never could I unite with the church if assent to this doctrine was essential thereto." She then goes on to relate what followed, how she stoutly maintained that she was willing to trust God and take her chance of spiritual safety with her brothers and sisters, not one of whom had taken the step she was taking, even if her creedal doubts left her outside the doors. Nonplussed for a moment, the pastor tried another way. He asked her to tell him when she had experienced a change of heart, to which the child could only tearfully reply that she could not remember any precise time. The pastor, however, insisted that she had been truly regenerated, and begged her to say how she felt when the light dawned upon her. I replied, Mrs. Eddy has written, that I could only answer him in the words of the psalmist, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me, and know my thoughts, and see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." This was so earnestly said, so the story continues, that even the oldest members wept. After the meeting was over, they came and kissed her, while to the astonishment of many, the old pastor relented and received the little girl into communion and her protest along with her. So was the first victory won, and it is perhaps significant that it was won without compromise and without bitterness, with satisfaction and tears of gratitude, achieved no one knew how as the final outcome.